Hello, I'm Brent Jensen, and welcome to The Sound of a Dry Martini, Remembering Paul Desmond, made possible by the Manieri Jazz and Swing Endowment. In this first episode, we'll be taking a look at the early years of Paul Desmond as his career got started before he met Dave Brubeck. That first tune was, of course, Take 5, one of the biggest selling singles in jazz history, and written by Paul Desmond. It featured Jamie Finley on guitar, Chris Seimer on bass, John Bishop on drums, and myself on alto saxophone. Starting out with the beginning of Paul Desmond's career, my career is actually kind of linked to Paul Desmond. My debut CD on Origin Records was titled the same as this series, The Sound of a Dry Martini, Remembering Paul Desmond. That was the often quoted Paul Desmond saying that when he was asked what did he want to sound like, and he said, well, I think I was trying to get the sound of a dry martini. He later regretted it because it was repeated so many times, but it stuck, and many people associate that dry martini sound with him. That's what I named the CD after, and I greatly underestimated the popularity of Paul Desmond. I knew he was very popular because of his association with Dave Brubeck, but that particular CD did quite well. It's been reprinted a couple times. We just issued it as its 20th anniversary. It was back in, not quite 20 years ago, 2002 I think is when it was released. And it did very well on the jazz charts just this past year. It was in the top 100, and it's some 20-year-old CD. So I've always had an affinity for his particular sound, and some of the early recordings that I listened to were Paul Desmond's, and we'll talk about those recordings a little bit later. These episodes are divided into decades, so this first one's going to be dealing with the 1950s. Paul is born in 1924. I'm not going to go through a lot of Wikipedia facts, because now in our internet age we can access all sorts of facts and bios. There is a lot of interesting stuff about Paul, some of it not as easy to find, so I will help kind of lead you to those particular articles, blogs, videos that are on the internet dealing with Paul Desmond. There's actually a book that is a great source. The definitive biography on Paul Desmond was written by his good friend Doug Ramsey, who lives in Yakima, Washington now. Doug was a professional, actually a newscaster. I think he even did the weather or something like that, but he became a jazz critic and writer, and several years ago wrote Take 5, The Public and Private Lives of Paul Desmond. He had access to a lot of Paul's correspondences with Paul had written back and forth with his father quite a bit, and revealed some things about Paul, who did have a very sort of sheltered or private life. He kept his private life away from the public eye, and so there's a lot of stuff in that biography. And there's also, I was very honored to do one of the transcriptions. There's several transcriptions of Paul's solos. I did one on Sacre Blues, which is from one of Paul's early recordings that we're going to talk about in this episode. So be sure to check that out. Unfortunately, that book is out of print currently. It was a big coffee table type of book, beautiful photographs in it, and all sorts of information that people had previously really not known about Paul Desmond. So definitely worth checking out. It is available in ebook form, so you can find it. You can probably find a hard copy online in eBay, but at greatly inflated prices. Unfortunately, the Manieri collection at the Anacortes Public Library, which has a great selection of jazz books and CDs, does not have that book. So those of you from Anacortes could always try to talk the library into finding a copy to put in their collection, because it's one of the great jazz biographies, Take 5, Public and Private Lives of Paul Desmond by Doug Ramsey. Paul grew up in the Bay Area. He was born in San Francisco in 1924. We got a picture of him here, very young, probably 18 or 19. He's playing the tenor sax, which we really never heard him play the tenor saxophone, but he started out on clarinet, played a little bit of tenor sax, played in different bands around the Bay Area, and didn't really meet Dave Brubeck, although Dave Brubeck is also from the Northern California area. He didn't meet up with him until they were both in the Army in 1944, playing in Army bands. It was around this time, as he became more active as a professional musician. In 1946, that's when he had left the Army, and he started playing around the area and took the stage name of Desmond. His born name is Brittenfeld, so it was Paul Brittenfeld. His father, Emil Brittenfeld, was a composer and organist from the Bay Area in San Francisco, and the correspondences between Paul and his father, they talk about music quite a bit, and it's really interesting. In the Doug Ramsey book, you get an insight into his own feelings as jazz music started to change with the emergence of Charlie Parker and the bebop era and so forth, and he knew his style was different than that, and it's really what set him apart from particularly Charlie Parker. So in 1946, and they go into the different theories of why he changed his name, but there was another musician that had the name of Desmond, and he always thought, well, that's kind of a smooth sounding name. If I change my name, I'll change it to Desmond, which he did officially in 1946. And shortly after that, that's when Paul begins his professional affiliation with Dave Brubeck. About 1951 is when the Dave Brubeck Quartet is formed. If you're able to get the Doug Ramsey book, there was a very contentious relationship between the two of them. They weren't speaking to each other for a couple different altercations. Paul, in Dave's mind, had stolen a gig from him at one point, and so the fences were mended by Dave's wife, I believe, is what happened, and she felt that the two of them should get together. And of course, one of the most popular groups in the history of jazz was the Dave Brubeck Quartet. The first early recordings that they did, and this is a picture of the early quartet. This is before Eugene Wright on bass and Joe Morello, the drummer, had joined. These are all musicians kind of from the Northern California area. They did their first several albums as a series of Jazz Goes to College. They were live recordings, and that's one thing that the Brubeck group also tapped into, was this audience, this largely collegiate, 18 to 20-year-olds listening to this music, and their group became very popular. They played on several different college campuses. There's jazz at Oberlin is one of the recordings. The early 1950s is when the quartet starts to establish itself. From 1951 through, well, actually 53 to 54, those are when those live recordings start to come out. The quartet itself, even though it undergoes several different changes, is together until 1967. So that's the major portion of Paul Desmond's career is spent within that group and associated with Dave Brubeck. But what I want to do in these series that we're talking about is kind of point your attention to some of the stuff that Paul did away from Dave Brubeck. He did several recordings away from Brubeck. Even while he was with the quartet, he didn't have a lot of time. As they became very popular, touring around the world, he would every once in a while throw in a recording session. That kind of happens in the 60s. In our next episode, we'll talk about his associations with some of the musicians away from the Brubeck fold. There's a very interesting interview, since these are two different types of saxophone sound altogether, Paul Desmond and Charlie Parker. Charlie Parker, really kind of the father of the modern jazz style bebop, along with Dizzy Gillespie. In 1954, there was a radio DJ that asked Paul to interview Charlie Parker. It's really interesting when you have two musicians talking with each other instead of a journalist and a musician. And so if you go to YouTube, just youtube.com, and type in their search engine Charlie Parker, Paul Desmond, or even Desmond Parker, there's probably 3-4 different postings of this radio interview that came from 1954. In its entirety, it's about 10 minutes long. I've seen a few that are excerpts that are maybe 3 or 4 minutes long, but you want to listen to the whole thing. They actually do get into some shop talk, talking about, how do you practice, how much do you practice, but it's just like you're eavesdropping on two musicians speaking to each other, after a gig or something, or in a bar. And it's a very interesting interview, done early on in this particular period, 1954, just as the Dave Brubeck Quartet is starting to get popular. Parker talks about admiring Paul's sound as being quite different than his, and Paul, jokes around like, well, I can't play your style. Your playing has so much technique, and it's playing so fast, and so it's an interesting little interview, but you can find it readily on YouTube just by typing in both of their names, Desmond and Parker. His first recordings as a leader happened right around the same time under Paul Desmond's name. The one that I enjoyed quite a bit, I think it was his second one, that came out in, it was 1955 or 1956. It's called the Paul Desmond Quartet with Don Elliott. Don Elliott was a brass player that played an interesting instrument called the mellophone, which is like a French horn, but instead of playing it like the French horn with the right hand in the bell, it has the bell forward, and I believe it uses valves instead of like a trumpet. So it looks sort of like some sort of trumpet from a Dr. Seuss book or something, the mellophone. And it sounds, on recording, sounds quite a bit like a trombone, but it's a little bit more fluid. You don't have the slide that you're dealing with. And that album is just simply called the Paul Desmond Quartet with Don Elliott. And we've got a picture with the kind of the primitivism painting on the front cover, very kind of in vogue in the 1950s or so. And we'll close this particular session, this particular episode, with a performance of one of the tunes that was on that particular album as a Jerome Kern tune entitled Look for the Silver Lining. And this features, once again, John Bishop on drums, Chris Seimer on bass, myself on alto saxophone, and this song, along with several others, are featured on that Paul Desmond Quartet album that was released in the mid-50s.